Sooners stand at 2-0 with the final non-conference game slated for this Saturday at Tulsa. So, Sooner fans, you should be happy, right? You should be happy. All right. We do understand they were 2-0 at this point last year and extended that to 3-0 with a romp of Nebraska. So we know how things can go. But so far, so good for the most part. But we will break down the good and the bad and the ugly and all of that on Sooners Live right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you all being here. You know that this is typically the time we all get together each and every Wednesday with Jason right here at 11:30 a.m. Central Time on a Wednesday. But please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications to know when we go live. We've got a Big 12 channel, and I'm going to drop that link in the chat as well. We've just launched a Big 12 and SEC channel, so Oklahoma fans see how we got you covered now and into the future. And, of course, Jason's here to make it all happen. We appreciate Jason, who posts a Sooners Tailgate show each and every Friday and then follows that up with postgame on Saturday. So we will talk a little bit more about that and leave that information on the screen as well. Jason, good to see you. How you doing?
Good to see you, Mark. Yeah, absolutely. Doing well. 2 weeks in the book. So, it's you get a little bit more of a sample size after 2 weeks to see, what the trajectory of each of the teams is going to be or could be. So, yeah, it's a great time.
Jason, for anyone who was anticipating Oklahoma just stomping all over SMU and going into the second quarter at 31-0, should first have taken their cue from Vegas. It was only a 15.5-point spread, and you can look all over college football and see two touchdown spread games that turn out to be either losses or tightly contested. Never really seriously threatened. And speaking of the point spread, I'm just glad that they covered, so I get my pick right. But they did do that in the fourth quarter and come out at 28-11. So whether you want to take the good or the bad first, Jason, your takeaways.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Mark. I think a lot of people just inherently look at the name SMU and look at the label Group of Five team and think that there should be a comfortable margin with that. But anyone that really knew anything about this SMU team coming into the game knew that this is a team that was going to be a very formidable opponent. Heard from a couple of people that really know SMU and really understand what that team looks like and will continue to look like this year. Probably a team that was more middle of the road Big 12 team. So really, not necessarily looking at it from a Group of Five, and probably honestly a team, Mark, you would anticipate challenging a team like Tulane for the American Championship this year. So had a lot of good talent on the offensive side of the ball, has some really good talent defensively on the defensive line. So yeah, like we said, I think this was a good test for Oklahoma coming into conference season. Certainly have Tulsa this weekend, but after that, getting into conference season and what you want to see is your team being stressed and being tested and know where the opportunities that you have to improve before the conference season starts. And I think the way, more so, Mark, the way that it happened was a little bit, and I don't want to say uncomfortable, Mark, I think was a little unexpected, right? I think a lot of people, even including myself to a certain degree, expected Oklahoma to have a lot more success offensively than they did. But also on the other side of it, probably expected SMU to score a little bit more than they did. 11 points is the least amount of points that they have scored from what I understand. And I'll have to go back and look, but I saw this anecdote over the last 4 or 5 years, the least amount of points that they've put up in the game.
I'm looking right now, and I can't find one.
Yeah. So I think coming into this game, Mark, I had said that, if Oklahoma holds SMU to 17 to 24 points, I think you can consider that, depending on how the points are scored, you can consider that a good defensive performance. So, yeah, I think on the plus side, Mark, you're super, super excited, cautiously optimistic because we went through this at this point last year, right? Where Oklahoma looked really good early on, and then conference season came and it started to become a struggle. And then that's when it went downhill. But this team looks a little bit different defensively. They look like there's a lot of quality depth there. That we're already experiencing some injuries on the defensive side of the ball. And they're seeing that depth kind of show itself. So like I said, the team like SMU, you only give up one drive, and that one drive was really aided by quite a few penalties, a couple of defensive pass interference penalties, and one in the end zone. So that's the good. I mean, I think that's the really good thing. After 2 games, you've given up 5.5 points per game. Considering the Arkansas State game. Now, the offensive teams, certainly the Big 12 schedule, will get tougher, right? This game against Tulsa, maybe not necessarily withstanding, but there's some games I think in the Big 12 that a lot of us came in thinking probably wouldn't be quite as tough. Maybe looks a little bit tougher right now, like namely Cincinnati. That's a game that I think me and a lot of people thought that Cincinnati was probably the lower half of the Big 12. See, a lot of people actually picked them last in the Big 12. So you don't get a ton off of their first game, but what they did to Pitt last weekend, really controlling that game for a large majority of the game, and Pitt made it a little bit closer. But still, those games are a little tougher. So everything that happened with SMU was, I think, was solid and a good learning experience. I think for me, coming out of that game, the biggest concern that you saw was probably the offensive line. The offensive line really wasn't able to sustain blocks and really protect at a high level, particularly the interior of the offensive line. They lost a lot of those one-on-one battles up front. I think that, and right now, there's not Oklahoma doesn't really have a game breaker at the running back position, which was not 2 weeks into the season, was not an area of the offense that I thought there would be a concern with. Gavin Sawchuk is still kind of coming back from injury a little bit. Javonte Barnes, for whatever reason, isn't playing a ton. They looked at the snaps, and Javonte Barnes had, I think, 3 or 4 snaps. Gavin Sawchuk had 1, and so I think those are things that are I think kind of a sort of not really to bail on that group just yet, but just something to keep in mind for Oklahoma going forward, because Tawi Walker, he's a nice running back, had 117 yards in the game. He's not, what you would probably think of as Oklahoma elite running back at this point. Now, Sawchuk and Javonte Barnes are probably those types of guys. So whatever those 2 kids need to do to get themselves on the field is going to be helpful for this team to be as explosive as they probably can be on the offensive side of the ball.
Just to clean up a few things with SMU and their competitive nature against good competition, we are talking about a team that has played in the best Group of 5 conference by far. This has been the standard of the Group of 5, and I know people still say it's a Group of 5, and I get that, but it was a good enough conference, obviously, to take 3 of those teams and move them into the Big 12, number 1. So that's largely been their competition and their chief competition over the last 5 years since they've been good with Sonny Dykes and now Rhett Lashley. Is against the likes of UCF, Cincinnati, and then Memphis and some other teams that have been good. And then keep in mind their Power 5 game last year was against a good Maryland team that went 8-5, won a bowl game, and they took them down to the final 4 or 5 minutes in the game. Close game, high scoring game, and they beat TCU the 2 previous seasons. So they've always been competitive for the most part against Power 5 competition. Yeah, the Tyree Walker, you got into it. I was going to ask you, but you pretty much covered it just in regards to our discussions, everybody's discussions in the offseason concerning Oklahoma football was heavy on Barnes and Sawchuk for obvious reasons. And then a Marcus Major, okay, is he finally going to stay healthy and be a factor? And then we heard good things in August about him emerging and possibly being the lead guy. And then, wow, Tyree Walker is the guy getting 21 carries.
Yeah, no, I think it's surprising to a degree, Mark. I think everything that I heard through fall camp was Tawee Walker was performing really, really well. Really kind of making the most of his opportunities. With Sawchuk being a little bit banged up and Barnes being a little bit banged up as well, he was getting the bulk of those opportunities. And so I think what we don't know, Mark, at this point is what the situation is with the lack of carries for Sawchuk and Barnes. Is it they're wanting to keep those kids fresh, for conference season and bring them along really slowly? And if so, then that's certainly understandable. You wouldn't think that you would absolutely need them to win these first 3 games, but but on the other side, if it's something kind of a doghouse situation, then obviously that's concerning. But I think Tawee Walker, like you said, he's done really well. Runs really hard between the tackles. Really, he's a kid that the first guy doesn't really ever tackle him. So he's good at getting those additional yards. Reminds me a little bit of Chris Brown a few years ago. Runs hard between the tackles. Not really a guy that's typically going to break off a 70, 80 yard run, but had one fairly long run, I think of 30 or so yards, if I remember correctly, against SMU. But he's, like I said, it's nothing I think that would be concerning right now. Mark, but as you get into conference season, maybe a little bit more. But I think ultimately for me, the biggest concern was, and there was a little bit of some discussion about play calling. The play calling was a little bit interesting. I don't typically get into that much in terms of, because you can always question play calls, and they had an idea of what would be successful in that game, and it wasn't successful, and they had to flip it around a little bit in the fourth quarter, as far as that goes. But the only thing that I say about that is I just, there was a lot of discussion around Oklahoma being really vanilla, not wanting to show everything, and I could certainly understand that to a certain degree. But I think once you're up by only 3 points, 14-11 score early on in the fourth quarter, I think you just kind of scrap that and do what you need to do to win. So I don't know if that's if to me that's a little bit of a cop out. But yeah, the interior of the offensive line just struggling against those guys is, I think that's the clear maturation that this team needs to kind of evolve from an offensive standpoint, because we've talked about this. Dylan Gabriel is not the type of quarterback, and this is nothing bad. He's thrown the ball really, really well early on this season in 2 games, 6 touchdowns, no interceptions, somewhere almost around the 80% completion rate. So he's doing really, really well, but he's not the type of guy that's going to be able to carry a team on the shoulders and like that. So he needs the support from the offensive linemen, running backs, receivers, etc. So it'll be just really interesting going forward, because as you look to, I was escaping the name. Cincinnati has a pretty solid defensive line. They're pretty solid up front, and I know no Oklahoma fan wants to hear this at all. But if anybody watched that defensive line that Texas threw out there on Saturday, that is and I watched, luckily I have a couple of screens, so I was watching both of them, both games at the same time. And, Alabama's got a humongous offensive line. They've got Caden Proctor that came in. It's probably one of the strengths of the team. And Texas held Alabama to just a little bit above 3 yards per carry in that game. And so that's, if Oklahoma thinks, if we think that as watching these games, SMU has a really talented big defensive line, Cincinnati does, Texas is undoubtedly going to be the best defensive line that they'll face all year. So understanding that's the area I think offensively that has to improve more than any of the others.
Jason hosts our post-game show right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate Jason doing that. 3 consecutive years here on the Sooners channel that is currently on SG1 Sports. So you've not missed anything or nothing's wrong, but SG1 Sports is where you find our Sooner show. But we do have a Big 12 channel that we also go live on each and every week. So this show is simulcasted over on our Big 12 channel that we launched about a month ago. You can find that. We will leave the link in the chat. Jason, we talked wide receivers, of course, the entire offseason, and the wide receiver core, at least on paper, coming into this season, not being anything close to Oklahoma standards, not being what it's been. I don't know how long you would have to go into the past to find the number of question marks. Now, Andrell Anthony, of course, is a guy that had one enormous game at Michigan, otherwise was non-existent. And he's kind of a guy that there is some level of hope, or was coming into this season, that he could be a game changer type of wide receiver. And he flashed that a bit on Saturday, it seems.
Yeah, Mark, it seems to a certain degree that Andrell Anthony is kind of almost solidifying himself early on through 2 games as a little bit of a go-to guy that Dylan is really looking to. Had that touchdown early on in the game, and probably the most wide open he's ever going to see, because he was wide open through the middle and just cruised into the end zone for a fairly short touchdown. But no, he's finding himself. I think the speed, he's starting to get even a little bit of respect in terms of his speed, because the SMU was playing a little bit of more of a kind of a deep zone coverage specifically against him, so backing off. So I think his next kind of step in his maturation is being able to get some of those stop routes, curls, and things like that, kind of shorter intermediate routes, now that he's starting to kind of get that on tape, the speed and the success that he had early on in game 1. So, yeah, I think they're very pleased with what they're seeing from Andrell Anthony. Jalil Farouk got a touchdown on a really, really nice play, catch or a run after the catch on Saturday to build Oklahoma's lead there in the fourth quarter. But, yeah, again, it's interesting. The offensive coordinator at Oklahoma is a guy that is whoever is in that role is typically very, very much maligned, and there's a lot of expectations that go into that. Jeff Lebby did not have from an Oklahoma fan's perspective, did not have the best of days on Saturday, and just that was kind of compounded by the Art Briles stuff that just blew up after the game. And so one of the interesting things with the wide receiver group was that there was a lot of kids that played a lot of snaps in game 1 that barely sniffed the field, if at all. Jaquez Petaway had like 9 catches against Arkansas State, didn't have a single snap in the game. Jaden Gibson had probably, I think what I remember was like 11 or 12 snaps in the game. Nick Anderson had 7 or 8 snaps. So for whatever reason, there wasn't a lot of those guys that played as much. You had Gavin Freeman had like 8 or 9 snaps. So I'm not sure exactly what really went into that, Mark, in terms of if there was just not a lot of confidence in those guys, or they wanted to get the Andrell Anthony, Drake Stoops, Jalil Farouk, those guys a little bit more run and get them in a position where they felt comfortable with where they're at. So I think that's something, again, that will be interesting to watch, because even Lebby in itself said that he probably made some mistakes with substitution patterns, probably made some mistakes in not throwing the ball a little bit more earlier on in that game. And so that'll be very intriguing to see, because he even mentioned about he would like to have a group where he have like a 6 to 8 man rotation. And so there was there was not a lot of that in game 2. And I know certainly things like that kind of ebb and flow based on the situation in the games. So it'll be interesting to see, maybe not necessarily specifically against Tulsa, but as we move forward, if that will be a situation where, they only feel comfortable with 3 or 4 guys, and that's where they go with, or they start to get a little bit of room with more of those guys, and get into a situation where they feel a little bit more comfortable with the depth there.
Now, this week, Jason, we're going to be able to have a direct comparison between Tulsa and how they performed in the passing game in terms of pass defense, I should say, against a Michael Penix. Now, that's raising the bar pretty high. Michael Penix is easily a top 5 quarterback in college football. And between he and the backup Dylan Morris, who entered the game at some point, went 2 for 2, and they probably were just running the ball at that point. Yeah. So rather early in the second half or fourth quarter, threw for 454 yards total against this Tulsa secondary. And now Oklahoma follows that up with a direct game against Tulsa the very next week. So it will be somewhat interesting to make that comparison between an elite passing attack with one of the best wide receiver rooms in the country to see if Oklahoma can have similar effectiveness.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure that, and you mentioned that, Michael Penix might be playing like one of the best quarterbacks in the country, at least top 3, I think, right now. And so, and you mentioned the wide receiver room. That is excellent. But no, I think it's a good, you're absolutely right. I think that's a good comparison for Oklahoma against Tulsa. It's a little bit of a different situation, obviously going on the road and seeing what, and seeing what that looks like. Your first road game of the year, there's always some, nuances that you see. I think the benefit is they play in Tulsa, which will probably be more of a 60-40, 70-30 Oklahoma crowd. But no, I think that you're absolutely right, Mark. Washington's probably not as balanced as Oklahoma will try to be, generally speaking, in that offense. But no, that's a great comparison to see where Oklahoma, really lands in terms of what that passing attack can be, certainly, and especially if you get to a point where maybe the offensive line doesn't play as well as you would expect, then maybe that's a situation where Oklahoma starts to rely on the passing game maybe a little bit more than they have in the past.
I don't know if you addressed this, Jason, in the post game. It probably wasn't out yet, but you referenced the Jeff Lebby situation on the field. The only thing I'll say about that is that you don't have to condone in any way, and I certainly do not, anything that Art Briles was involved with at Baylor. I can understand both sides of this. I could understand saying, that was an event at another university that's been dealt with, so forth and so on. We're in a different place, and he's part of the family. Therefore, he should be allowed or would be allowed on the field to partake in pictures and whatever they did celebrating the win after the game. Or for good, we'll call them business purposes, we're not going to allow that, as turned out to be the case. So I really have no issue with either one, but it turned out to be a situation where whether Jeff Lebby did it out of ignorance and not knowing how it would be viewed and just thought, that's my family, he's part of my family, and I allowed him to come down, and it appeared as though Brent Venables was taken off guard initially. He's coaching a football team and dealing with 105 people. I don't expect him to know everybody who's on the field and whoever's taking pictures or whatever after the game. But obviously it was Lebby was dealt with, and that situation was dealt with in that there was an apology given, and that should not have taken place, was kind of the stance of the athletic department.
Yeah, no, you're right, Mark. It's, the Oklahoma fan base was in an uproar over this for a good part of Sunday and a good part of Monday as well. And so I'm with you. I can kind of see both. I definitely see both sides. I think so. here's kind of from what I understand, and I don't know if this is ultimatum that was given to Lebby, but based on his, coming here, I think one of the things that was said is Art Briles is not going to be around, which that means he's not going to be on the sideline. He's not allowed on the field. Specifically, those are the two things that I believe, from what I know to be true, was that he was essentially told, like, he's not going to be around. And so I think some of the narrative that I'd heard Saturday night was that he was given some sort of a sideline pass to be on the sideline, and then he was on the field after the game, which Lebby came out in his offensive press conference that they have every Monday and said that wasn't the case. He was just in the stands and he came on the field. So I think Lebby knew, he knew that he wasn't allowed to be on the field, and I think and I don't know. I'm not going to assume what his thought process was. But I think a couple of things that were interesting on what happened Sunday. Lebby's wife, which is Art Briles' daughter, posted something on Instagram that family over everything, and a picture with Lebby and Art Briles and their kids. And I know that Jeff Lebby had changed his Facebook and Instagram photo on Sunday, interestingly enough, to him and Art Briles and his kids. And so it was one of those situations, Mark, that I think if I was him, I probably would have just taking my chewing or taking my reprimand and just letting it go. But I think they poked the bear a little bit, which kept
he certainly did.
Right, which kept the thing going a little bit longer than maybe it should have. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, and he mentioned it, perfectly in his press conference, that it created a distraction, and that's what it did. It created a distraction with, and it was after the game, so it's not really, I mean, just a distraction in terms of it's something that Joe Castiglione had to deal with. It's something that Brent Venables had to deal with, and so. As we sit here on September 13th, I don't think there's not any doubt that he's going to be the offensive coordinator for the remainder of the season. I think at this point, based on after the game when he was asked this, I don't know if you've seen the footage, but he was very, very defensive. And then he was slightly less defensive, but you could tell in his kind of tone of voice and his demeanor in his press conference on Monday. It was one of those things where he was being forced to say what he said. It didn't seem like he was really genuine in the way he felt. So, and this is just my opinion. I would be surprised if he's back next year. And things could change. And I don't know that I'm not saying this to say that there's a strained relationship or anything like that. And I think he probably wants to be here. I mean, this is his alma mater, but I think with those things, with everything encompassed, and there was a fair amount of OU contingent, Mark, that was not supportive of Jeff Lebby being hired as the offensive coordinator here because of his relationship and his, he was there at Baylor during that time. So not that he's necessarily to blame or anything, but kind of the whole guilty by association. Sure. So it'll be interesting. I mean, I think that is, he's gotten a lot of flack the last couple of years from time to time because of, play calling and substitution patterns and things like that. But I don't really get into that a lot, and I think the problem is, Mark, and I know that this just from everything that you follow in college football. Oklahoma offensively, there is an extremely high standard that they have set themselves up with, and I think it permeates not only to the offensive coordinator but to the quarterback position as well. And I think there's been a couple of different media outlets that are saying, okay, it's time to bench Dillon Gabriel and it's time to let the Jackson Arnold show begin. Well, I think that the problem that happens here is, and this is completely unfair to Dillon Gabriel, but the expectation is that he's the next Caleb Williams, he's the next Kyler Murray, he's the next Baker Mayfield, and he's just not that level of player. And he, and he's and I think everybody expects Jeff Lebby to be Lincoln Riley and have that much success, and it doesn't always translate into the same success that you're anticipating. I mean, look at Clemson in game one with Garrett Riley. I mean, I think everyone assumed, okay, we're going to insert Garrett Riley as the offensive coordinator, and they're just going to roll. Well, it hasn't happened as you would expect, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily always happen, right? So I think there's a lot of unfair criticism. Some it's probably due, but I think by and large the majority of it is unfair, and so. I don't know, what that future will hold. I think, most people believe that Jeff Lebby, in terms of the coaching staff, he's probably the next in line to get a head coaching job, wherever that might be, if it's someplace that he's, that he's really interested in. So I could be wrong, but just from everything that I hear and kind of reading the tea leaves, it might be kind of a situation at this point that could be mutual at the end of the year, which is to me is it's almost a lose-lose situation for Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. You're going into the SEC and you're installing a brand new offense, which is the least optimal time to do that, or you've got someone else that's maybe not a high profile offensive coordinator that will run the same offense, but maybe is there on staff, just something to keep an eye on as the season progresses for Oklahoma this year.
Interesting. I'll amend my original statement slightly. I still can see both sides, but however, as you outlined, Jeff Lebby was given direction, an ultimatum, and then he didn't. Now, when you're given that kind of direction, if you have an issue with it, you, of course, address it immediately and directly. You don't think, okay, I'm going to nod my head and say, yes, sir, and then I'm going to circumvent the situation and still do what I want. Yeah. So there is that. And of course, Jeff Lebby, if he is short in his tenure at Oklahoma, is going to move on to other jobs, whether that be as an offensive coordinator or as a head coach, and he could possibly have to deal with the same situation. Yeah. If he's that adamant about bringing Art Briles down onto the field or having him participate in some manner from time to time. Sooner Tailgate Live, everyone. Jason gets together with all of you, typically Friday at 4 Eastern, but have those notifications up so you know when Jason is able to deliver that on Fridays. And he's got post-game, of course, on Saturday after the Tulsa game. When is the game time this Saturday?
2:30 p.m. Central.
Oh, it's a 3:30 game. Who's carrying that game?
I think it's ESPN2.
Okay.
Is carrying that one.
That sounds about right. All right.
Yeah. It's not as quite of a as solid of a lineup this Saturday as it was this past Saturday. So
not at all. Here's a number you don't see very often. Danny Stutsman had 17 tackles Saturday.
Yeah, he's a guy, Mark, that has and he led the Big 12 in tackles a year ago, but he is over these first two games, he's playing like an All-American linebacker. And of course, the linebacker group that I would say overall is probably more they seem to be have more depth and more polished and are more polished than they were a year ago, Mark. And so I think that that kind of leads to, obviously, Brent Venables is the coach of the linebackers, and so he's his awareness is much better. He's much more under control than he was a year ago. At times, he doesn't get himself out of position and things like that. So yeah, I think if he continues in this way, he could turn himself into having an All-American year this year.
Great stuff from all of you here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate the comments and questions coming in. A lot of Jeff Lebby, of course, as we would anticipate. with Tulsa not being necessarily the challenge even that SMU presented last week, and then going into a Cincinnati game to kick off the Big 12, what would be your numbers? Let's say 1, 2, whatever the list might be, in regards to things that you would like to see improved and worked on going into the Big 12.
I think like I mentioned, offensive line play, particularly in the middle of the guards and center position. I think having that solidified, I think will be big. Kind of establishing a playmaker on on the offensive side of the ball from a running back position perspective. I think defensively, and it's nothing that Oklahoma's really struggled with. I think what's happening right now, Mark, is there's a lot of these teams over the first, and I say these teams, Arkansas State and SMU, that have done a lot of max protection against Oklahoma, so the Oklahoma improved pass rush hasn't really had an opportunity to, really show itself and solidify itself. I think they're doing well, just being able to rush the passer. But with a lot of this max protect and really getting the ball out quickly is causing the pass rush to maybe not look as improved as it is. So I think that's the one thing that would be interesting is to see. Is just to see if they're able to kind of get home and get not only get some pressure on the quarterback, but get some sacks. And I guess the only nitpicky thing would be on the defense is, there's been some situations where we've had a couple of busts and there's been a couple of guys wide open, just kind of continue to solidify that. The difference is this year when that happens, and there's misreads and things like that, in the past years, this has been 30, 40-yard gains. Like this year so far, it's like 5 to 7-yard gains that they're giving up. So continuing to kind of improve in the areas that they need to improve defensively ahead of some of these teams that are going to be able to, protect and hit open receivers at maybe a higher level than what Arkansas State was. But again, I still have a lot of respect for what this team has been able to do over the last first two games, and then specifically SMU and how good they are from an offensive perspective. So I think this is one of those weeks, Mark, where you have to guard against a letdown, because I think this is a kind of a prototypical letdown game, right? You've got SMU, which is one in the early season that everyone was pointing to as kind of a barometer game, and then you've got Tulsa on the road before going to Cincinnati for your first conference game. So I think really guarding against the letdown and just kind of showing up and going through the motions Saturday for me is a big one, because I think Oklahoma's early on, I think it's a 27.5 point favorite, somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know if it's gone up or gone down. But just doing what you're supposed to do and being able to dominate that team that you should be able to dominate, and seeing what you have defensively. They're going to throw the ball around a lot as well, but they do have a decent running game. I think they ran for almost 200 yards, if I remember right, looking at that box score against I'll pull it up as we're talking about that, but looking at that box score against Washington, 168 yards, 4.2 yards per carry. So a decent rushing attack. So Oklahoma should be able to get after them in the passing game. But I think just guarding against the look ahead for me would be the big thing going into this game.
Washington had 2 sacks, so that 168 probably more in the 180, 185 range. So a pretty formidable rushing effort against a top 10 team from last year. All right, folks, appreciate y'all being here at the Voice of College Football. Again, join Jason after the game for Sooner post-game live right here at the Voice of College Football. And also, we've dropped the link to the new Big 12 channel, the new SEC channel. So please subscribe there. We believe most of you were invested in those two conferences for obvious reasons. But even if you're not, if you overall enjoy what we're doing here and want to help us grow toward the future, please subscribe to those channels. All right, Jason, Anything else?
No, I don't think so. I think it'll be, like I said, interesting to get through for Oklahoma specifically, get through the non-conference schedule and then get into the conference schedule that, in some respects looks a little bit, some areas looks a little bit tougher than maybe it did earlier on. Like I said, Cincinnati looks a little bit better. Texas certainly looks a little bit better than maybe, not necessarily than we thought, but, would they be able to put it together? And they have, at least for for 1 week, and they're always going to be up for Red River, so that situation. So, but yeah, no, exciting to get into the conference, and we start seeing not only Oklahoma, but we start seeing a little bit more of what some of these teams will be for the totality of the year.
All right. Our next show here on the network is Michigan Live at 5, Florida State at 6, Miami at 7. Please join us on those channels and talk some more college football with us. Jason, good to see you. And we look forward to your post game. Have a good rest of your week.
All right. Same to you, Mark. Thanks, guys.